Pentateuch. It's not one person writing.
It's not just that there's certain elements within the individual stories that
you don't have hints in the narrative that make you go, whoa, 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 whoa.
That's right.
That conflicts completely with what you just said over here. And why is it all of a sudden this and this and this?
You don't want to open your hand because you're afraid of what will happen.
Shut up!
Right.
It happened!
Yeah. They write Spider-Man comics. They're not like coming up with off-the-wall stuff where people walk on ceilings like...
When I found out, this is jumping to Jesus, which is outside of the whole discussion here, but welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Today we're going to be discussing another apologist argument. What I find happening in the internet world is an apologist will make an argument or try to find a way to be clever in getting out of a pickle or a problem or whatever. And there's some sophisticated way where they'll try to engineer an escape route, such as the idea that Jesus didn't fail as an apocalyptic prophet. We have conditional eschatology coming on the scene and rising amongst Christian circles that know that there's a problem if you don't try to make it conditional, because Jesus was either wrong, Paul was probably wrong. And then what are we able to depend and trust the word of God and what's being said in these books? So we're dealing with Genesis. Michael Jones, who's a friend of ours, but also someone we can't agree with on several points, has made kind of some remarks, and we had to look it up. I texted him and said, hey man, help me out. Where's this academic source that you're getting these ideas from? In Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, it seems to be a consensus, Dr. Josh, Dr. Kipp, on the idea that we have two sources. They do not agree with each other. In fact, in many places, you could say they might even conflict with one another. They aren't meant to be read as a single source. But I've heard Michael Jones say that, well, we have other creation accounts where there's two accounts that somehow go together as if it's maybe the same author later writing it. I don't know, trying to reconcile this issue. And he's taking jabs at documentary hypothesis, these kind of different views. So that kind of leads us into the details to allow you to go into what is he trying to say and what are the problems with this argument?
Yeah, I think maybe sort of to begin sort of broadly, when we think about something like the formation of the Pentateuch, whether we're talking about the documentary hypothesis or, what people have been calling like the supplementary hypothesis, where you have either sources being brought together or you have layers of redaction over time for theological purposes. In either case, there's very broad agreement, whether one holds to a more like European view of scholarship, or somebody like Dr. Joel Baden, who obviously holds to the neo-documentary hypothesis, is that you have two primary, we can call them sources here, P and not P, right? P and non-P. And there's almost a universal consensus, certainly among Pentateuchal specialists, that what we have in Genesis 1 is from a different author, group of authors, whatever, however one wants to shake that out, from what we see in Genesis like 2, 4 and following. That being said, so that there's broad agreement there, whatever position that you hold to on the formation of the Pentateuch, it's not one person writing this whole thing. So the problem, I think, is, and we want to be careful about this, is that whoever is, like let's say it's P, for example, who's writing Genesis 1, appending this one, let's say that that's the way we want to go with this. The way that the text is structured, it's not that he's writing trying to ensure that we have two distinct versions, right? He's not trying to call that out. In fact, I think that many would argue that there is an attempt to try to make this smooth, right? Of course, you don't, right? It's very difficult to do that sort of thing. But I think we need to make sure we nuance it in that way. But this is obviously a sore spot, as you said, if you're viewing the text as either substantially of Mosaic authorship or of single authorship or something in that vein. And again, I know there are different views even among evangelicals that sort of have started to, accept more editorial redactions, allowing them in. And I think of necessity, they have to do that. Otherwise, it's just going to become sort of silly. But yeah, that's the issue that, I think we're trying to deal with here. And I'll turn it over to Kipp because I'll sit here and just ramble on. But really what we're dealing with in this particular case is looking at two distinct creation narratives or accounts in one, essentially Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Or are we looking at a single narrative by a single author and it's just a style of writing where you have like a more general account in the first part and then something more specific in the second.
Yeah, and this is kind of how this gets presented then by Christian apologists. Genesis 1 as a general creation, and then Genesis 2 as more specific and focused on Adam and Eve in particular, on day, quote unquote, day 6, right? I think it's important to point out one of the reasons why scholars are convinced of these the fact that we have two creation stories has to do with a whole bunch of things. It's not just that there's certain elements within the individual stories that aren't easily reconciled or conflated. You've got different orders of creation. For instance, the man is created first in Genesis 2 before the animals, whereas in Genesis 1, the animals are created first, and then the man. The way in which the God is presented is quite different. God speaks things into existence in Genesis 1. In Genesis 2, he's actually, literally molding out of clay with his hands the man and the animals as well.
It's fair to say a little more primitive in a way.
It's earthy, it's hands-on, it's interactive, whereas in the Genesis 1 creation story, it's much more of a transcendent sort of picture. And of course, most famously, what most people know within this model of the documentary hypothesis is that in the priestly account, God is identified as Elohim. In the non-priestly account, he's identified as Yahweh Elohim. But this might be this also might be one of these elements that the P author, or whoever put these stories together side by side, tried to do in an effort to bring them together by calling God in that second account Yahweh Elohim. So there's various elements that show them to be different. The first creation story is very structured in that it follows a specific formula that repeats itself from start to finish. You've got the naming of the day, then you've got God speaking. Whatever God speaks comes into being. It's pronounced as good, and it repeats itself throughout. In the second creation story, it follows a much more narrative sort of flow. It's more story-like. It doesn't have that same kind of structure. So there's all these differences that scholars look at that and go, wow, yeah, like these are two clearly different things. And the easiest way, the most most parsimonious way. I was thinking from the perspective of Occam's razor, the best way to look at these is as two separate stories, because on their own, they each individually make a lot of sense.
And so, if I could point out for just a second, and I want to get right back to you, but if we had a completely unified Pentateuch, right, that evidenced the single authorship, everything flowed really well, and all we were looking at here is Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and this was the only place that it looked like there was something distinct, then I think it's more reasonable to start questioning, well, gosh, look, everything else is unified.
That gets into prior probability stuff, right?
Look, I don't know all this mathematics stuff. I'm not a smart.
It's not even. Well, seriously, look at if we have a very good reason to think something is a certain way, like we look at the laws of nature. That's the whole point about miracles, that it gets lost in this whole thing, and then they get the human card thrown at you, and it's it really is weird to me. Yeah. It's like, How often do you see people walk on water? How often do you see people rise from the dead? How often do you see people multiply food, fish and bread? This is an extremely low probability that this stuff happens because it doesn't happen before. If the Pentateuch was like clearly not having these issues and we're looking at 99%, but then you get to the one, you might have a real good fight on your hand to go, I mean, why would you then say this is contradicting when we have all this? That's a good case. Not when we find it over and over and over and over. You can't even get the father-in-law of Moses right. I mean, there's so many issues.
There's these repeating patterns throughout the text. With regards to Genesis 1 and 2, though, I think it's important to point out here that regardless of the opinion on whether this was a single author or two different stories, I think that virtually everybody recognizes that there are clear distinctions between these two stories, which is why so many apologists have, employed the sorts of arguments that they have in an effort to bring them together. One of the ways that has become popular is to focus on these as you've got a general story of creation. God's working more broadly, and then he's focusing in something that Michael Jones had suggested in his documentary Hypothesis Response video. I think that's where it was. I think so. Where he said that this is actually this idea of having dual creation stories within a single work is actually part of an ancient Near Eastern literary technique. One of the things I want to say about this right at the outset is that quite often what you will find among apologetic responses to source theories within the Pentateuch is a lot of dependence on literary sort of arguments where they will try and emphasize larger motifs, larger themes, larger elements within individual aspects of the text as a way to say, like to sort of tease out more of a poetical or an artistic sense of what's happening in the text. Quite often these sorts of things are in the eye of the reader or the interpreter. You can sort of employ it. It's actually fairly easy to see these sort of patterns or structures, these sort of painting in broad strokes on all sorts of different types of literature. Even, it's one of those as pattern building machines. This is just what we do, right? So even in two separate compositions written by separate people, you could find ways to show commonalities between them. It's not hard to do.
Well,
so
can we just, we're getting closer, right? I can feel the heat. It's starting to happen. And I love this, but this is the point. So you're going to want to stay tuned.
Kind of dancing around this, aren't we?
I love that you are dancing around it, though. This is important as we're having foreplay right now, okay? I have to make everything sexual because we're dealing with ancient Sumer, and they were very sexual.
They really were.
Really sexual in their mythology, so we will be today. But what I find interesting about what you said is it's not like these are completely irrelevant narratives. They're both creation narratives. Yeah. He does this in Noah's flood, right? So they're both flood narratives. So you're going to find commonality because they're dealing with a similar tradition, but when and how they're handling it is radically different. And so we got the Joseph tradition. Is this just one single narrative? Are we making too much out of this whole weird thing about, they sold him into Egypt and then they sold him to the Amalekites and the Ishmaelites and or is there really two compositions, two traditions that have commonality? They're dealing with a guy named Joseph, but one has a certain tribal group they want to emphasize and the other one has a different tribal. So I love what you're saying because it builds up to the point of it's not like we're talking about totally irrelevant narratives. They're really similar narratives, have similar kind of traditions.
Another way of saying this is a creation story will feature very much the same sorts of elements and follow similar patterns, especially those coming out of this similar geographical area,
Right.
where they all know each other. So we should not be surprised to see some repetition in broad theme or categories. They all feature the gods or a god, and they're all creating humans, and they're all answering questions of what is it the humans are doing. So you're going to be able to see those sort of repeated patterns if you're looking on that macro scale.
Yeah.
Mm.
So what's happening here in these two creation stories, Michael Jones is depending on an article that was written by a guy by the name of Isaac Kikawada back in 1983. And
it's a very long, in-depth article.
It's 6 pages.
I think the first pages of the 6 is like front matter or something. I think it's
it's 6 pages, and 4 of those pages are just outlines of the text. So it's literally like a page and a half of actual.
It's almost
discussion.
like a note.
It's a
really
note.
is.
It's essentially a note. But the article is trying to make the case that this general creation, specific creation, is a structure that you can follow, not just in Genesis 1 and 2, but also in the Sumerian myth, Enki and Ninmah, and then in the story of Atrahasis.
Yep.
So, and the way that the author wants to do this, he basically says, reading. He starts with Enki and Ninmah. He says, reading Enki and Ninmah, you can break that whole story into 2 parts, and then you can read these 5 basic motifs occurring A, B, C, D, E in the first part, and then A, B, C, D, E in the second part. And it's
but they're in a different order.
No, in Enki and Ninmah, they're in the same.
They're
order.
in the same.
They're in the same order, and it's and they're very, very general. Like, it's God's creation, humankind, decreeing of
Fate or something.
fate, and then division of labor, something like that.
Something.
Yeah.
And then it supposedly repeats in the second half. But then when it comes to Atrahasis, it's like A, B, C, D, E,
F, G, I think.
No.
Okay,
No,
that's-
in A, B, C, D, E in the first half, but then in the second half, it's like A, D, C, B, E. Like, it mixes them all up. And then in the Genesis one, he has to add stuff. So it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then it's like A, D, F, B, G. Like, it's basically, when I look at something like that, I'm like, right away, if there's not a clear enough pattern that you can see it repeating, like, specifically.
And you only have 4 pages to deal with 3 major literary texts.
It's pretty insane.
Huh?
But it looks like this looks to me like a guy who is just seeing what he wants to see.
Right.
Right. And then building trying to build an argument.
And the thing is, when you actually get down into the narratives, there's a logic to these narratives that just doesn't follow what's going on. So, like in Enki and Ninmah, you have this initial creation state where you've got work being done by the minor deities that's being overseen by the major deities. They get upset, and so Enki and Nama. And Nama's supposed to use Ninmah as like a helper along with some other deities. And they're supposed to create a human to carry the baskets, right? So this gets done. Everybody's really happy. There's
Creation,
rejoicing.
Mankind.
Yeah. Right. Check.
Yeah.
And then everybody's really happy and they throw a feast.
Yeah.
Well, in the midst of this feast, that's where the break is supposed to be.
Yes.
The first break.
The transition is during the feast.
But the feast is what sets up the whole second, scene, right? So they're having this feast, and Enki and Ninmah are sitting there getting drunk, which is one of the things that Enki does in these literary texts. And they challenge each other Like, oh, well, I can create, like a human and I can like give it problems, and then you have to decree its fate and say where it's going to go and like what role it's going to play. And so like they do this creation thing where it creates somebody with like weak hands, can't hold anything. And so Enki says, all right, I declare that that person is going to be a servant of the king. This person doesn't have legs or he's paralyzed. All right, he's going to be a silversmith, or this one can't hold back his urine. Like it's fun. But the point is that a lot of these, interestingly enough, a lot of these jobs that are assigned to these people that have what we would consider to be like handicaps are people that are that you would find in like a city, right, doing specialized jobs. Whereas in the first part, that they're the thing that they're celebrating, it's making basket carriers, ones that are carrying like the mud for building. And so again, the point is that there's a very natural logic to the progression of the story. It's not like you've got, okay, part A is now, part B is just like a repeat of part A, just in different words. That's not what's going on.
Another way to put it is that the authorship seems to be a unified guy or person authoring that particular text. You don't have hints in the narrative that make you go, whoa, 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 whoa.
That's right.
That conflicts completely with what you just said over here. And why is it all of a sudden this and this and this?
And I don't think you can, like, you can't take out that second part as a standalone story. Right? Like, it just doesn't, it wouldn't make a lot of sense on its own, which is, I mean, this is the big difference between creation stories. You can have one without the other and not miss a single thing of importance between them.
In fact, you probably feel like you have a more
better
sensical
understanding.
story.
Like, it makes better sense.
And the thing is, they're so vastly different.
Yes.
And this is one of the things, I just want to throw this in. This is one of the things that's sort of frustrating. And it's frustrating to me, so I know it's got to be frustrating to Joel Baden. And that is, there's this idea among evangelicals and apologists that, the only way that you divide these sources up, these different parts of the text up, is based on the divine name, right? So, all right, so anywhere that it says Yahweh, well, that must be this source. And anywhere it says Elohim, that must be this source. Or worse, you start to generate these lists of vocabulary. Right? So anywhere it says shivka for a female slave, well, this must be, X source, or, P or J or whatever. And that's not the way that this functions. It's not the way that either the documentary hypothesis and certainly not the neo-documentary hypothesis function. The way that they did this is it was based on narrative inconsistencies. And they were saying, okay, here we have a flood story. And my God, this is a confusing jumble, right? We have two different commands. We have two different takings of the animals. We have two different boardings. We have all these things, two different disembarkings, all this stuff. And so because there were these narrative inconsistencies, they said, well, we have to try to separate out these stories and figure out what goes with what. Once they did that, once they created the two sources, then they noticed, well, shit, this one always uses Yahweh. That one always uses Elohim or whatever. Or this one always seems to use Amah for female slave, but this one always seems to use Shivcha. So it's not the other way around. So that criticism where, you're just picking out vocabulary and just, because look here, this one, it's supposed to be P, this one uses Shivcha, and this one that's J uses Shivcha. This all is a bunch of nonsense. That's a straw man, right? And it's a terrible straw man that says you don't understand the document hypothesis.
Is it fair to say that might have worked centuries ago when Wellhausen, was first?
I wouldn't say Wellhausen, and again, like this is something you definitely would want to ask, like somebody Joel Baden or Jeffrey Stack or Bruce Halpern or something. But there was a time, I think, that following Wellhausen, that scholars began to initially, based on the separation of the narratives, began to generate these types of lists, and they started to like subdivide out the sources, right? And I think that if you read through what Joel Baden says in his composition of the Pentateuch book, like he critiques this, and so like there is a fair critique to level against certain people who, utilize the documentary hypothesis incorrectly. But it's not a shot against the documentary hypothesis, and certainly not against the neo-documentary hypothesis.
Okay.
If anything, it's a shot. Well, yeah, the people who misuse the theory more often than not tend to be apologists who are invested in this conclusion as a way to paint it as ridiculous. I think, the recent example of this that comes to mind is the shit show that erupted over this Mount Ebal inscription. The fundamentalist, apologist, archaeologist who discovered this thing was running around and giving interviews on all of the apologetics channels, talking about how this tiny little tablet of lead destroys the documentary hypothesis because it mentions El Yeho, the God Yahweh. And because these two words appear side by side, that's it. Documentary hypothesis debunked.
Right. I'm converted.
Yeah. And I'm like, this is the problem I'm getting at. This is the caricature. This is the straw man version of what the documentary hypothesis is. No, it's not just, parting out the names. There is so much more to it. It was through, and it took, I think it's important, like it took years to refine the theory to the point where to what we have today, and what Joel Baden promotes in his book, The Composition of the Pentateuch, is this refined idea of these two, or I guess these four different sources and their distinctions, not just in terms of the name of God, but in terms of the type of language they use, the way that they write and how they structure sentences, various nuances of theology, how they view things like the priesthood and the tabernacle and the temple and the Ark of the Covenant. These are all important, finer details that you can tease out and see, like within the individual sources, as quite distinct.
Is that you're finding those not to separate the sources. You're finding them after the sources have been separated. That's the key to this. So certainly, to be fair, right, I would and again, I'm not a Pentateuchal specialist, so I defer obviously to those that are. But there certainly must be cases where you have something that's in contention. It could go either way, and you would say, "Hey, look, this one uses Yahweh." The likelihood it could go either way narratively, but this is probably going to go to J. Yeah. Or hey, this has a very common word. Like I had a professor that used the word ostensibly all the time. Ostensibly this, ostensibly that. And if I had a note left on the table in the conference room, and it said, "Ostensibly, you'll find this," and I had to make a determination of who wrote this, I would say, well, I can't guarantee it, but this is probably, by this particular professor that used ostensibly all the time. It doesn't mean that no other human can use ostensibly. It's just sort of an interesting word that, if it came from professors.
Yeah, I know, right? I like to use that because it's like, that's another problem, right? Did it really happen? Well, it looks real. And there's a whole topic people aren't even aware of realism. There's a whole subject matter to research about what is called realism, which is verisimilitude. Homer, and a lot of classes to study Homer looking for realisms. And if you read Homer and you're really serious about geography, people, places, things, you're going to find things that are real. They look real. It looks like that. Hold on. That's history. No, the author is anchoring it to things. So he's writing a fiction, but he's anchoring it to real people, places, and things, which is the problem. Because then you get to the Gospels and you're looking at this literature that has fantastical things in it, but then there's some realism. Oh, these are history, or are they mythographies, as other academics I talk to? There's so many. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, certainly think about the Exodus, right? I mean, the Exodus has verisimilitude because they use aspects. These people are not stupid, right? Like it's like when somebody I know they hate to hear it, but like when they write Spider-Man comics, they're not like coming up with off the wall stuff where people walk on ceilings like. That's stupid because it's Spider-Man. But I mean, like normal people is what I meant. But I know they're using like a real city with, hot dog vendors and newspapers like that because it gives it verisimilitude. That's right. Yeah. It's verisimilitude. But it doesn't mean that it's trying to represent like some sort of historical idea of necessity.
Or the idea of just a hero and a villain. I mean, that's everyday real life, right? There's someone who's doing things in society. They're bad. They just make it into a fiction.
Yeah.
I really love how you guys parse this out, and we discussed this in particular. Just one more point. It's hard for me to not like really think it's hard for me not to try and look at the motives.
Sure.
And I'm sure Christians do the same thing. They go, oh, your motives. You want this not to be true. Like, honestly, it wouldn't matter. Like let me just put it this way with the Gospels. Again, we're talking about realism. Let's suppose it's really historical in many ways. I still wouldn't read walking on water, rising from the dead. I wouldn't read that as like literally what is true. I'd say people believed it. Just like people believe this and people believe that. We were talking about all sorts of crazy stuff with the World War I stuff.
Yeah.
We're going to get into things just by rumors or someone writes something purposefully with it being fictional. People interpreted it as not. The guy comes forward and says, no, I didn't mean that. Right. Shut up.
Right.
It happened.
Yeah.
Okay. Like, so it can have a life of its own. Point is like, it's hard for me to sit here and think they're not motivated to try and save the text. And this is why as an ex-evangelical, really fundamentalist person, I do have much more respect for those who are more orthodox, more not fundamentalist, and they don't worship a book. They say, hey, we have a tradition. We have faith. We believe, but like, we don't need this book to be this magical thing that evangelicals have made it out to be.
Sure. I mean, like the more commitments that you have, the harder it is, I think, to do, good scholarship. And I mean, that's just of necessity. And I don't think that necessarily has to be like from a religious standpoint. I mean, think about it. When you write a dissertation, you're like, please don't, find something new that disproves this,
oh my
right?
God, yeah.
So like we have those commitments, right? Because we want our stuff to actually stand the test of time.
But this does happen.
Yeah.
Like I wrote for the first 2 years of my program, I was writing what I thought the dissertation was going to be. And then I read an article.
Yeah.
And it completely shattered what I was working on and sent me in a totally different direction.
Yep.
So I mean, like that happens, but that is like that's what we're supposed to be doing as scholars is engaging with the text and following the evidence where it goes.
And that's the key though. See, like there's this difference, I think, between hating the idea that you've just spent 2 years but you don't keep going with that main idea that you were doing.
Right.
Or you try not to.
And there's a moment too, like it is, oh my God, 2 years of work. What do I do with this new information?
Yeah.
Now, right? And it is, there's a point of kind of like there's an instant point of devastation where you're breathing into the paper bag and you're like, okay, I can recover from this somehow. But like in the end, in the direction that I ended up going is so much more interesting, in my opinion, with what happened.
But what you don't do is sit there and go, well, isn't it possible? Isn't it possible that the position that I have could still work? I mean, like, what if there's this outside? No, you say, okay, look, this sucks. It sucks.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I wrote this whole thing and now this new information has come out. Damn. But like I'm going to fall absolutely flat on my face in my career if I just keep going down this path, because this isn't how scholarship works. And I will get eaten alive if I try to keep pressing this bad hand. But I'll give you a real life example here that happened like a year and a half ago. Eric Klein, who is a brilliant archaeologist that wrote the book 1177. Back in like 2008, he wrote a book From Eden to Exile, I think is what it's called. And it's just looking at significant, essentially fundamentalist evangelical approaches to certain major stories. So the Eden narrative, he looks at the Exodus, looks at the conquest, and so on and so forth. Well, like he wrote this chapter on the conquest and was like, look at Jericho, look at Ai, look at, Lachish, like look at these other sites. Like I think he looks at 5 or 7 sites and says, look, it just doesn't work, right? We know from the archaeology that it doesn't work. Well, then, Lorenzo Negro comes out with this YouTube presentation, like in 2021, where he says sort of in passing, like, oh, we might have a late Bronze Age wall fragment at late Bronze Age or at Jericho. And so I saw this presentation, was like, what the? I'm flipping through trying to, because he's got a 2020 publication out, an article. He says nothing about it. Like, what in the world is going on? So I got a hold of Eric Klein and I said, do you know anything about this? And his response was really, really telling to me. Now, this is a guy that's written a book, and a major chapter is like Jericho doesn't have any evidence of this. And he goes, no, but get a hold of him and please let me know. This would be really exciting. Holding conclusions in an open hand. Yeah. That's the one thing that people with theological commitments cannot do, because the theological commitment does this. And what you do is you go, how can I keep my hand? And so you'll see them fighting it. No. Maybe. Just hold that shit there, right? Hold it right there. And it sucks. Like if I write a book on slavery, right? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And it gets published. And then all of a sudden, like this, we find new tablets about laws of Hammurabi, and it's like completely overturns this theory I've got. That's shit, right? It sucks. But this is part of the game. You have to hold these conclusions in an open hand, because if you don't, the academia just pass you by, right? Because you're not doing scholarship anymore.
One comment, and then maybe you can comment as well about this. And since we just did our interview recently about your story, Kipp, but Josh, we're going to have to get yours while you're here. I've never got your story. Having my hand open to kind of analogize to what you just said, or, convey. When I found out, this is jumping to Jesus, which is outside of the whole discussion here, but the topic is related because it's inspiring philosophy, Christian apologists that we really engage a lot. It was having my open hand and those like scary fears of what I was gripping for so long being wrong. That open hand and being real with what I'm seeing, the evidence seems to point to, is why I no longer hold the faith. Yeah. And it's not that I can prove a resurrection didn't happen.
Right.
Nobody could prove it didn't happen.
Sure.
No one. Skeptic, I don't care. You can't prove that didn't happen. It's probabilistic. It's when you see the overwhelming evidence of several things, conflicting narrative accounts, issues that might have shown up in the narrative that we're thinking, okay, looks like a vision, like they had a vision of Jesus, not so much as a physical. But then you start getting into even deeper stuff for me, and it started seeing other gods, demigods, with apotheosis narratives, ascension narratives. There's even empty tomb narratives, contemporaneous in the mid-century CE, like Charius and Kalihero, or Kallerho, however you want to pronounce it. And it's about the novel where Charius goes to his loved one in the empty tombs there, and he's like calling out the goddess, the whole nine. When I saw all of this stuff contemporaneous, and the people who had imperial cult worship, they like set up priesthoods and temples to the cult of Caesars, who were called the same titles as Jesus. I go to myself and go, why did I just didn't know.
Yeah.
And I wasn't wanting to know. Yeah. Then when I started knowing a thing or two, my whole confidence in thinking this was actually true, but those other ones aren't, that all went real down fast. And it was like, I had to be honest. So I couldn't hold and nourish that and be like, well, in light of all this contrary evidence and evidence that other figures had their own little miraculous events and things, I couldn't hold on any longer. I had to be like, seems like there's a trope, just generally speaking, mythic, cultic, legendary tales of heroic figures, noble men, amazing philosophers. The list goes on and on, whatever the category may be.
Inspiring philosophers.
Inspiring. Yeah. And so and you know what's interesting about that? Having the grip, when I had the conversation about these kind of comparisons to Roman and Greek mythology or even antecedents and stuff, that grip was there and he's willing to go, well, so they might have something in common. It's but this could be, and it could be this. And it, just like you were talking about, Josh.
I will say just very quickly, I think that I was very fortunate, the circumstances in which I experienced my deconversion, because for whatever else you could say, I was in a safe space. The things that I would suffer would only be like in my family. I was in an academic setting where I was with people that held this view, and it's not that they were atheists. Most of them were Christian, right? But they all said, look, like this position that you're holding, and it wasn't even that they were saying that, right? It was just, they were just teaching what we know. Mm-hmm. And I'm sitting there going, oh my God, well, okay, like this doesn't work, this thing that I'm holding. But I knew that if I let it go and adopted, took a more objective stance on this and tried to come at the data, again, more objectively, that I wasn't going to be taking this huge risk, right? It's not like I was doing it in the midst of an evangelical seminary. And I was doing it in the midst of a very historical critical
secular
practicing, secular university, even though the professors themselves would identify as Christian. So I would say that I was very fortunate to be able to do that. And I don't think a lot of people have that. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think that people are like stupid. I don't think that people are being stubborn. I think a lot of this has to do with one, having people around you that you trust, that know what it is that they're talking about. And then two, having a context in which doing this is safe. And I think those things are very hard to come by. And so I want to be clear about that. It's a tough thing to do.
Yeah. And it is frightening, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't want to open your hand because you're afraid of what will happen, and that fear can be a very, very powerful motivator, I think, to keeping it closed.